Hi there, my name is Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel Bandy's Books, and today we're here to do a February wrap-up. I had an excellent reading month in February, honestly far better than I expected. I picked up a crazy amount of extra work in February, so I did not anticipate reading a lot of books in the month, and I still ended up reading about what is average for me in a normal month in the shortest month of the year with a crazy schedule, so I am super proud of myself. But on top of that, my reads were really good in February. This is, I think, going to be one of my highest rated months of the year. So I'm really excited to talk to you about the statistics and then give you the ratings of all the different books that I read. So let's just jump straight into it. Let's start breaking things down. And let me get to these amazing recommendations so you can add them all to your TBR. So first of all, in the month of February, I ended up reading 24 books. I am stoked on this. Around 20 to 25 books is my typical average for a normal month. And February, of course, is the shortest month. And like I mentioned, I worked like an 83-hour week for the Super Bowl. And then the week after that, I spent recovering. So I was really surprised to see this number. Total pages was 8,106. I am super pleased with this again. This averages out to about 337 pages per book, which is a little bit less than usual, and that's because I had a couple shorter like novella type stories in here. In terms of pages, 33% of my reads were under 300 pages this month. 63% of my reads were between 300 to 500 pages, and only 4% of my reads were above 500 pages this month. Now, one of my goals for 2024 is to do better at reading nonfiction, and I think I crushed that goal for February. 29% of my reads were nonfiction this month. That equates to about 7 books, and about 71% or 17 of my books fell into the fiction category. I'm really pleased because typically in years past, I've averaged about 2 nonfiction reads per month. My top 5 genres for the month were literary fiction, historical fiction, contemporary fiction, memoir, and history. My longest read of the month was The Women by Kristin that came in at 471 pages. My shortest read was Ring Shout by P. Djeli Clark that came in at 185 pages. So with the stats out of the way, let's go ahead and jump right into my ratings. We're going to start with the 3-star category. And I just want to state up front that all of these books are in the 3-star category, but they're on the very high end of the 3 stars. Most of them were pretty close to being 4 stars. And they're just like little things that were holding them back a bit for me. So I want to just emphasize that these are not bad books. I think typically most people think of 3 stars as being kind of like meh, mediocre, but these are definitely a little bit better than that. They're just, lacking a little bit of something to make them like really stand out in my mind. First up, I have Coleman Hill by Kim Coleman Foote. This is autofiction about Kim Coleman Foote's family. She grew up in a very dysfunctional environment with a lot of people that behaved in very toxic ways, and she found herself questioning why her family behaved the way that they did. And so this autofiction kind of explores the history of her family and who they were and all the legends and folklore around different family members. I will say that this cast of characters is extremely vivid, and you know who everyone is. Like, you can very, very clearly imagine each person. That being said, the entire cast of characters is super unlikable, and not in a way that felt like it pulled me into the story, in a way that I kind of had to fight my own impulse to continue reading. Again, I think these portrayals are probably true to the people in her family, but it isn't an easy read at all. There is a lot of dysfunction and violence, and you should definitely check the trigger warnings if you're thinking about reading this book. Then I have You Are Always Mine by Jo Piazza and Christine Pride. I absolutely loved We Are Not Like Them, which you can see is on my shelf behind me. And so I was really anticipating getting into this one. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite as good as their previous work. I think if I had not read We Were Not Like Them, I might have liked this one better, but I know what their dynamic can be like, and I know what their writing can be like and how poignant and powerful it can be, and this one just lacked some of that oomph. This book follows a character named Cinnamon who finds a white baby while she's hanging out at the park, and it turns out that this white baby is the child of sort of an acquaintance. And so Cinnamon decides that she's gonna hold on to this baby and maybe try to convince its mother to come back. But of course, this is a complex world. Cinnamon is Black, this baby is white, the authorities get involved, and this follows Cinnamon as she battles the legal system to keep custody of this child. I thought that this book had some poignant things to say, and I do think that it explored race and adoption and foster care and all of that in a thoughtful way. It just wasn't quite as powerful as their previous work. I think that while it touched on some really relevant themes, it didn't delve quite as deep into it as their previous work did, and I really wish that it had. I felt like there was room for them to maybe just go even a little bit harder on some of the topics that they picked to talk about. Then I have Everything Is Not Enough Enough by Lola Akinmade Akerstrom. This is a book that follows 3 different women in Sweden as they deal with race and dating and the men in their lives, their work pressures, all sorts of things. So this book is a sort of follow-up to Akerstrom's previous book, In Every Mirror She's Black. And unfortunately, I felt like this one wasn't quite as strong as the first one. While the characters were compelling and some interesting things happened, there were large parts of this book where I wish a little bit more was happening, or I didn't really understand the characters' logic and their decisions. I felt myself getting frustrated at points in the book. Overall, I think the story was pretty interesting, and I don't think that the writing is bad at all, but I just wish a few different characters had made a few different choices in this book. Then I have Our Lady of Mysterious Ailments by T.L. Huchu. I read the first book of this series a little while back, and that's The Library of the Dead. This is about a young woman who is in Edinburgh. She is able to commune with spirits, and she uses this ability to help people around her to earn an income for her family. She lives with her grandmother. And in this particular book, she gets offered the possibility to go to a famous school, but while she is going to that school, she's not allowed to use her abilities to make any kind of money. And that's a complicated situation for her because she literally feeds her family. There's also some pressure on her to send her little sister away to a boarding school, and that causes some complex dynamic issues between her and her little sister. I also rated the first book in this series 3 stars, and this one is kind of in the same area. It's not a bad story. I really like our main character. I like the overall concept. I just think that there's some kind of something special missing about it. It's not a bad fantasy series, but it's definitely not the most memorable one that I've read. I think 5 years from now, I'll probably maybe vaguely remember oh yeah, that was a pleasant enough read, but I don't think it'll stand out in my mind as one of the top series I've ever read. And the last of my 3-star reads is My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Braithwaite. So first of all, I love this cover. This is so eye-catching. I love the title. Everything about this makes me want to read this book. Unfortunately for me, while I found this concept super interesting, we have this sister who's narrating the story, kind of observing her sister dating this variety of men. And as she sees accident after accident befall these different men, she starts to realize, oh my gosh, my sister might be actually a serial killer. I, again, love the concept. I just don't love the execution of this. This is a very short book, as you can see. It's a little novella. And so it left the story feeling a bit rushed for me. I didn't feel like there was enough space for this, idea that the sister is a serial killer to really develop. And the ending of the story was a little bit abrupt for me. I think that's intentional in some ways, but I wish that it had ended at a different point. I just personally didn't love where the author chose to stop the story at. Overall, I think it's an interesting concept, and if you think that serial killers are fascinating, you'll probably find this book fascinating. Now we're gonna jump into the 4-star category. I have so many books in the 4-star category this month, and without reservation, I would recommend that you check out any of these that sound interesting to you. So first up, I have The Door of No Return by Kwame Alexander. This is about a young boy named Kofi who is learning how to be a man. He lives in an African village. There are all these rituals and traditions around coming of age. He's just about to take some of these tests towards manhood when a rival tribe enters his village and kidnaps him and a bunch of other young men. When he is brought to where he's going to be held prisoner, some very brutal and horrific things happen, and Kofi's journey just gets darker and darker from there. This book starts out relatively light and it moves very quickly into a very dark and serious topic. I don't know that I was quite that aware of how dark this was going to get when I first got into this, and so some of it caught me off guard, but not necessarily in a bad way. This is set to be a trilogy, and honestly, where this book ended, I'm not sure where it's going to go from there, but I found it really fascinating. I will definitely read book 2 in this series. And if you're interested in African history and mythology, I think that this is worth picking up, but definitely take a look at some of the trigger warnings for the book. Then we have Forged by Blood by Ehigbor Okosun. This is a book that's based on Nigerian mythology, and it features a young girl named Demi who has the ability to perform blood magic. There has been a genocide in the kingdom that she lives in, and almost everybody who could practice blood magic is either deep in hiding or has been killed. When Demi's ability to perform blood magic comes to the attention of the ruling family, people come after her, and she has to flee to try to keep herself safe. I found this book to be a solid start to the series and a pretty enjoyable read. I happen to read quite a bit of African fantasy, and this is a little bit similar to books like Children of Blood and Bone and Akata Witch It has kind of a similar mythology basing for the story, but I thought that it did some different things with it, and our main character Demi is pretty likable. She's an easy protagonist to get behind. So I think that if you like African fantasy, you'll probably enjoy this one. Next up is my one obligatory romance read. I pick out one every year for Valentine's Day. So this year I chose Before I Let Go by Kennedy Ryan. So I am not a big romance reader at all. In fact, I pretty much avoid this genre whenever possible. And so I didn't know what to pick out. And so I reached out to some of my friends over on Bookstagram who are big romance readers. And honestly, hands down, almost all of them recommended this book. So you know when you get unanimous recommendations like that, it's time to pick it up. I can't believe I'm about to say this, but I'm actually pretty glad that I picked this book up. First of all, this cover is just stunning. I absolutely love the way that this was designed. But even more so, I really enjoyed this book. And it did two things that I usually dislike. First of all, we have characters that own a restaurant / are chefs. And second of all, we have the romance element. Now, I work as a chef for a living and have been a chef basically my entire adult life. So it's really, really hard for me to read characters that run restaurants or work as chefs because they're always so inaccurate and so incorrect. And then I really struggle with romance because the same thing, I feel like romances in books often are not realistic at all. This book, however, does both of those things very well. I feel like they really capture the element of owning a restaurant. I feel like they really capture relationships. This book follows Jesmyn and Josiah, who are recently divorced. They still have 2 kids that they're trying to co-parent, and they have a restaurant that they've created and built together. So they are still pretty tied up in each other's worlds, but they're both hurting from this divorce. There's wounds that are definitely still very raw, and suddenly they start to realize that they're still really attracted to each other, and that with their change in situation, maybe they might give dating a try again. Look, this book was good. It was emotionally complex. It was just the right amount of sex in it. The sex was handled really well. A lot of times I really struggle when there's like a lot of explicit sex in books, not because I'm a prude. I don't mind it at all. It's just I find myself laughing a lot the way that people describe sex in books. So I really enjoyed that this was like sex that was well written and enjoyable. I could just like decompress and like lose myself in the story because I wasn't like giggling over the author's like horrible word choices. So I'm gonna jump on this bandwagon and I'm gonna say if you like romance, or even if you don't like romance and you just want to dip your toes in the water and give it a try, maybe pick this one up. I feel like this is a special type of romance. After that, I had Let Us Descend by Jesmyn Ward. This is a book I was really looking forward to. So I love Ward's writing. I read Sing Unburied Sing. I have Salvage the Bones. I think that she is a fantastic writer. And I've heard kind of mixed things about this book. So I was a little nervous going in, but it did not fail me. This is about a woman named Anise who is sold from one plantation, and she's on this like horrific march from one location to the next. And there's a lot of magical realism that is used to kind of help her deal with what she's going through. She kind of descends into the spiritual world and connects with her ancestors as a coping mechanism to survive the horrors and the brutality that she's experiencing. I think a lot of people struggled with the magical realism elements of this, but I actually think that it worked really, really well. And I think Ward does a fantastic job in creating these like magical, mystical settings that are not like verging all the way into fantasy, but definitely make you recognize that there's something outside of the normal world going on. I think she also conveyed the horror of the situation really well. You feel for Anise, you feel for the people that are with her and what's happening to all of them. I thought that this was really well done. I'm not really getting all of the really critical feedback that I've seen from other people. Maybe it's just because Ward is such a brilliant writer, and when your books have been held to such high standards, even when you write a pretty good book, it just maybe doesn't feel as good as some of the others. Then I read Sink by Joseph Earl Thomas. This is Joseph Earl Thomas's memoir of growing up, and he grows up in a very volatile and dysfunctional home environment. He is sort of a geek, nerd. He doesn't really fit in anywhere, and he does some really unusual stuff to kind of cope. At one point, I think he has a pet alligator, which really stood out in my mind. I was like, oh, how cool is that? I would have loved to have a pet alligator as a kid. One of the things that I really liked about this memoir is that Joseph is really different from everyone else in his family. They tease him and make fun of him and give him a hard time for the things that he's into. He just really feels isolated and doesn't fit in. And I think most people would be able to relate to that to some degree. I will say that there's some graphic content in this book and a few really cringy scenes, but I think it kind of fits within what's going on in the book. It wasn't like gratuitous or just thrown in for shock value. If you like reading memoirs, this is an interesting one to pick up, and it's very short, and it's kind of told in like a vignette style, so it's pretty easy to digest. Then I have No Heaven for Good Boys by Keisha Bush. This is a book set in Senegal and is sort of a modern day retelling of Oliver Twist. This follows Ibrahim and Etienne as they are sent to the capital city, where they are basically kind of put in the possession of an older gentleman who is supposed to instruct them in Islamic faith, teach them good values, teach them hard work. They're to become talibe. And in return for these teachings and lodging, these boys are supposed to help earn money. They're supposed to, clean up the area that they're living in, help take care of the school. But it becomes really clear really quickly that Ibrahim and Etienne and all of the boys they're living with are being taken advantage of and basically abused. This is really focused on Ibrahim, but Ibrahim wouldn't get through the story without Etienne. And I think the relationship between these two cousins is really fantastic. This book is really interesting and it taught me about something I had really no clue about. This situation of being a talibe was a very, very interesting concept for me. This is well written and emotionally impactful, and I love that this was set in Senegal, which is a book that I haven't seen a ton of books set in so far. Then I have Neighbors and Other Stories by Diane Oliver. So Diane Oliver wrote this collection of short stories, and then in 1966 she passed away at, I want to say, about 26 years old. Her work has recently been refound and compiled into a book, and this is her collection of short stories all these years later. This book mostly features stories about Black families in the Jim Crow era, and it talks a lot about the going-ons of the times. I thought it really captured the time and the tension very, very well. I think each story was very compelling. I didn't find myself hitting a story going like, oh, I didn't really enjoy that one. Then I read The Selfless Act of Breathing by J.J. Bola. This is a short novelette about a man who is trying to decide if his life is worth living. He currently lives in the UK and he's just not happy with anything. Things are just kind of gray and bleak. And so he takes off on a trip to the United States. And in his journey through the United States, he has kind of an interesting adventure. Things go a little bit differently than I think he initially anticipates. And I think that it starts to challenge his beliefs about unaliving himself. This isn't the most complex or most deep book, but it's an easy read. It's enjoyable enough. I was engaged in what was happening with the character and interested in where things were going to end up. I think especially the second half of the book, there are a few surprising turns that come up. So if you need a quick and easy read with some deep themes in it, then this might be a good book for you. Then I read Barracoon by Zora Neale Hurston. So this was one of my classics for the month. And my mom actually read this book last year and told me it was really interesting. So I decided to pick it up in February. This is about one of the last Black men who was brought from Africa to the United States as a slave. And Neale Hurston was the only person that was able to interview him and get a record of what happened to him, his life after he was brought to the United States and everything. So this is a fascinating book. This is one of those books that is once again written in the dialect that was spoken in the region that this man lived in. So I would recommend maybe reading it on audiobook. I think that makes it a little bit easier if you're not familiar with this particular dialect. Then I read Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. I also decided to read this one since I enjoyed Barracoon. And this is about a young woman and sort of a coming of age. She goes through a series of marriages and relationships, and it kind of follows her as she progresses and grows and matures and kind of learns what she wants in life. Our main character, Janie Crawford, starts this book out really naive, and we see a lot of growth from her in a very short period of time. I thought this was really well written, and for considering how short it is, it packs a hell of a punch. It covers so much different territory, a multitude of different relationships, and it covers so many big events. It's really amazing how much Neale Hurston was able to pack into this one book. I thought that this was really well done, really engaging. Again, Neale Hurston likes to write in the dialect that some of the characters speak, and so some of the dialogue could be a bit difficult if you're unfamiliar with this dialect. If that's a problem for you, consider reading the audiobook instead of reading the physical book. Personally, for me, I didn't really find it difficult, but oftentimes when I'm reading books at home, I read the dialogue out loud. So I was able to just kind of read it and hear what it sounded like and figure things out from there. And my final of the 4-star reads was The Hormone Shift by Tasneem Bhatia. So this is a book that is all about female hormones. It covers everything from puberty through menopause, and it talks about why hormonal balances are so detrimental to women and then how so many of us are suffering from them. It also talks about what happens when we start to balance our hormones and why modern medicine isn't up to date on some of this. I thought this was a pretty illuminating book. Having had a lot of health issues related to my reproductive organs, there was a lot of really relevant information for me. I've been doing deep dives into like hormones and reproductive topics just for this particular reason. And so I felt like I learned a lot from this book. There were some areas where I felt like maybe she was kind of tiptoeing the line between like medical science and kind of conjecture, but overall I thought it was pretty well done. All right, and finally we're gonna get to our 5-star reads. I have quite a few of these ones too, and I'm very excited about that. So first up, I have The Women by Kristin Hanna. This is a Vietnam War era historical fiction, and it follows a young woman who is raised in San Diego in a very conservative traditional family. She's been taught that women are to be passive, to be meek, they're there to be pleasant for their husbands, to run the household. And in an act of bravery, after her brother signs up to go to Vietnam, she decides to volunteer to join the nursing corps. She is accepted and she is sent off to Vietnam, where she is completely shocked by what she finds. This book follows her through her tour of duty in Vietnam and all of the horrors that she finds in war. But the thing that I thought that was the most well done is when she comes home, it follows her battles with post-traumatic stress, isolation, and the struggle that she finds to reassimilate with her family and loved ones. I've mentioned this a couple times before, but my ex-husband served in the Iraq War twice, and he came home with pretty bad post-traumatic stress. So this is something that is a lived experience for me. And reading this book was very visceral and very hard. It brought up a lot of really complex and difficult feelings for me. And there were scenes in this book that I could actually like hear in my own memories of things that happened that were very similar to what this character was experiencing. All of that to say that I think that the way that Hannah portrayed the post-traumatic stress in this book was fantastically done. It was really accurate, and this book overall was incredibly researched. There's an author note at the end of the book where Hannah talks about how she interviewed all of these different women who served in Vietnam about their experiences, about what life was like when they came home, and that she really, really tried her best to be as accurate as possible. I think that that shows. If you like historical fiction, especially women-focused historical fiction, about an era that I feel like doesn't get a lot of attention, I highly recommend this book. I think this is a fantastic read, and I think it will make you aware of some things that you might not have been aware of previously. Definitely check the trigger warnings on this one though. Obviously with war and post-traumatic stress, you're gonna deal with a lot of, difficult things, but there are some very specific things in this book that might be triggering for people to read. So look into it. It's not just about the war and the post-traumatic stress. Then I had The Attic Child by Lola J. This is told in dual timelines. We have a character named Celestine in one timeline who was stolen from the Congo, brought to the UK, and is kind of basically being turned into like the foster son of a wealthy, kind of strange white man. And then we have Laura, a young orphan girl who spent some time in a house, and in the attic she finds a beaded necklace, a letter, and some things that send her on a journey to find out who they belong to. This was a really interesting story. I thought the dual timelines in this worked really, really well. Oftentimes, I'm very nervous when you have dual timeline settings and one is in the current times and one is in the past. I feel like that can get really cheesy really fast. But Jay handles this like a pro. I think that these two stories weave in and out of each other so smoothly. It makes so much sense. And I think that the main storyline of Celestine and what happened to him is so moving, and it covers a piece of history that I think people are familiar with to some degree, but maybe don't know in detail. I love that this touched on the Congo specifically, and I think Jay's author note at the end of the book explaining why she picked the Congo and how she developed the story was really fantastic. Then I have You'll Never Believe What Happened to Lacey by Amber Ruffin and Lacey Lamar. So Amber and Lacey are sisters. Amber Ruffin is a pretty famous comedy writer. She writes for the Seth Meyers Show, and she has her own show as well. Lacey is her sister, and Lacey still lives in the Midwest where they are originally from. So every day, Lacey will call Amber and tell her about the crazy racist shit that happens to her, in her normal life. This book is basically a compilation of those stories. While racism is obviously a super serious topic and not usually a laughing matter, the way that this book is set up and the way that these stories are told, you can't help but laugh because it's just, most of them are so absolutely absurd and insane. The thing that I really like about this book is something that I'm finding a little bit hard to articulate. But basically, this story gives example after example of like the types of microaggressions and things that Black people go through on a day-to-day basis. But the thing is, the way that it tells these stories is very approachable. So if you were just beginning to learn about racism and microaggressions, you could read a book like this and see example after example after example of shit you really shouldn't do. And it makes it very clear why you shouldn't do it, but it doesn't do it in a way that's like a lecture. It makes it a little bit more relatable, if that makes sense. I hope that I've articulated this well enough to be understandable. I thought this was a fantastic book. It was frustrating in some ways because there's shit that happens that you feel like, man, that should never be happening in this current era. But it was also very humorous, and I really appreciated that these women took the time out to write this and like make it such a readable book. Then I have The Girl Who Smiled Beads, A Story of War and What Comes After by Clementine, Wamariya, and Elizabeth Well. So this is a book about Clementine's life. She grows up in Rwanda and then the genocide occurs. She becomes a refugee and she's taken to the United States. I believe she's like 12 when she's brought here, and she sort of starts life all over again. Her older sister comes with her, and the two of them, while they've both experienced similar things, they start to kind of grow apart. They have very different experiences once they get here. And then this also talks about like reuniting with their parents and their siblings that have survived the war, and what that's like, how they've all had such different experiences that they're finding it hard to relate to each other. And Wamariya also talks about post-traumatic stress, you know, the anger and the rage that she was feeling, this just unexplainable emotion that she couldn't find a way to vent out. I thought it was really poignant, really well written. I haven't read too many memoirs from Rwanda, but I thought that this was really well done. It gives enough detail to understand what's going on without getting really graphic or really dark. I thought that Wamariya did a fantastic job about talking about some really, really difficult topics, but in a way that I think most people would be able to read it and understand it. And my final 5-star read was Ring Shout by Djeli Clark. So this is a short horror sci-fi novella in which the Ku Klux Klan is sort of inhabited by demons. There's like a supernatural situation going on. And then we have a group of Black resistance fighters who are taking on the Klan and fighting back. This sounds kind of bonkers, but it works so well. And I'm so impressed by the fact that this is done in such a short amount of pages. I think this is only like 185 pages long, if I remember correctly. Yeah, 185 pages with the acknowledgements. So the amount of story that this covers, the complexity of the story, the character building, the world building, all of that in 185 pages. It's really fantastic. If you like horror, especially if you find yourself liking books like Dread Nation, where you have a really unique setting anchored in like a historical fiction era, I think that you'll really enjoy this one. So those are all of the books that I can talk about for the month. I also had a couple books that I read for the BookTube prize. They were all in the nonfiction genre, but that is the most that I'm able to say for now. I will not be talking about any of those books until the voting round is over, but once this voting round is over, I will do a video where I review each of them in detail. So to end this, the average rating for the month was 4 stars. That is the highest average rating I think I've ever had in a single month. I am thrilled with that. This month was so good. Honestly, I didn't read a single book that I would consider bad. Definitely some were, you know, better than others, but everything was pretty solid. I think you could pretty much pick any book off of this list and find it at least somewhat enjoyable. My favorite read of the month was The Girl Who Smiled Beads by Clementine Wamariya. This was such a poignant memoir. I really appreciated learning more about Rwanda, about this person's experience as a refugee, what it was like to come to the United States, and some of the things that she went through as she dealt with like her emotional regulation and everything like that. This is really beautifully written. I love the incorporation of Rwandan folklore into the story as well. And I think that Wamariya just does such a fantastic job of talking about difficult subjects. My least favorite book of the month was Coleman Hill. Again, this is not a bad book. I just think it's a difficult book. Everybody in this story is so unlikable, so dysfunctional. And again, I think that's the point. If you listen to Kim Coleman Foot's note at the end of the book, she, you know, explains that as a child, I saw this around me and I wondered why everybody was like this. And so I think that this was a very authentic portrayal. I just think it's a really difficult book to get into. And you know, I admire her for writing this autofiction, and I think she did a remarkable job of writing it. It just was not a pleasant experience reading it. So I think that's everything for February. I am stoked with this month. I hope that you enjoyed hearing about my reads. If you did, hit the thumbs up button, comment down below, let me know if you've read any of these books. Did you like them? Did you dislike them? And let me know what your favorite and least favorite reads of February were. Did you have any standouts? Anything that you think I should be adding to my TBR? Definitely drop those in the comments. And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button down below, as well as the notification bell, so that you never miss a video, and that way we can see each other again soon. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.